What would you do if someone looked you straight in the eye and told you that you didn't belong just because of the color of your skin? Now imagine it happening at 30,000 feet, trapped inside a plane, surrounded by strangers, with nowhere to go. This is the story of Maya Henderson, a brilliant civil engineer carrying designs that could save millions of lives. She boarded Flight 729 from Atlanta to Seattle, expecting nothing more than a quiet trip before the most important presentation of her career. But what unfolded inside that cabin would test not only her dignity, but also the courage of everyone watching. A wealthy mother and her daughter demanded that Maya give up her seat in business class. Their words were laced with prejudice, spoken loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Passengers froze, flight attendants hesitated, and for a moment it felt as if hate would win. But then the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out, and what he said next would not only silence the entitled mother, it would leave every passenger stunned and change lives forever. Before we begin, make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that remind us of dignity, justice, and hope. The air inside Flight 729 was calm, filled with the usual symphony of boarding sounds, the soft thud of luggage being lifted into overhead bins, the polite murmurs of travelers exchanging seats, and the faint hum of the aircraft preparing for takeoff. It was just another morning flight from Atlanta to Seattle, a route taken by countless business travelers, families, and dreamers heading west. But within moments, this seemingly ordinary trip would turn into something unforgettable, a story that no passenger on board would ever forget. Maya Henderson adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, the one her grandmother had given her years ago when she graduated with her engineering degree. She placed it carefully beneath her seat, as though it carried not just documents, but pieces of her very soul. Inside were the final blueprints of a design she had worked on for 3 relentless years, a flood-resilient bridge model that could transform how coastal cities protected their people from climate disasters. She had run the calculations 100 times, tested the structures in simulation labs, and presented fragments of her research at smaller conferences. But this trip was different. The National Infrastructure Summit in Seattle was where decisions were made, where billion-dollar budgets were assigned, and where projects like hers could either vanish into obscurity or reshape the future. Maya leaned back, exhaling slowly, reminding herself of her grandmother's voice. "Baby girl, you build bridges, not walls. And when someone tries to tear your work down, you stand taller than the storm." Those words had carried her through every exam, every setback, every meeting where someone looked at her skin before listening to her ideas. Today, they were armor. She tucked a strand of her natural curls behind her ear, her tailored navy suit fitting perfectly against her tall frame. At 37, she had the calm confidence of someone who had faced storms before, both literal and figurative. Yet even as she reviewed her notes, her stomach fluttered with nerves. This presentation could change everything, not just for her career, but for communities vulnerable to rising seas and devastating hurricanes. The cabin of business class was nearly settled. Executives pulled out laptops. A man 2 rows ahead barked into his phone about quarterly earnings, and an elderly couple quietly held hands, their eyes on the safety card in front of them. For a brief moment, Maya felt grateful for the silence, for the cocoon of focus before her biggest challenge. And then she heard it, a sharp, entitled voice cutting through the hum like a knife. "Excuse me, I think there's been some kind of mistake." The tone wasn't curious or confused. It was commanding, accusatory, the way someone speaks when they expect the world to rearrange itself for them. Maya looked up slowly, her dark eyes meeting the figure standing in the aisle. Victoria Langford stood with her manicured hand gripping the seat in front of Maya's. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her designer coat draped over her shoulders like a cape. Beside her, a girl about 10 years old clutched a plush toy and looked around the cabin with wide, expectant eyes. Chloe Langford, even at her age, she carried herself with the posture of a child who had never been told no. Passengers nearby glanced up, sensing tension ripple through the air. A hush began to settle, the way silence gathers before a storm. Victoria's voice carried just loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "My daughter deserves this seat more than someone like you." The words hung there, heavy, slicing through the quiet cabin. A couple of passengers blinked in disbelief. A man across the aisle raised his eyebrows, muttering under his breath. Maya froze. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained composed. She had seen this before at board meetings, at restaurants, at airports. It was never the words alone, but the way they were delivered. "Someone like you." 3 small words packed with centuries of prejudice. She adjusted her posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and said nothing at first. Her grandmother had taught her that silence could sometimes speak louder than fury, but she also knew that silence could be mistaken for surrender. Chloe tilted her head, her voice small but echoing with her mother's disdain. "Mom, why is she sitting here? People like her usually sit in the back." The innocence in her tone made the cruelty even sharper. Several passengers gasped audibly. One woman, 2 rows behind, covered her mouth with her hand. The cabin, once a neutral space of travelers, now felt like a stage where everyone was watching, waiting, inside. Maya's heart pounded. She thought of her blueprints beneath the seat, of the bridges designed to stand against hurricanes. She thought of the countless nights she had stayed awake, proving equations while others doubted her abilities. And she thought of the promise she had made to herself to never let anyone reduce her to a stereotype. But she also thought of the child, 10 years old, already parroting words that diminished another human being. Maya felt a pang not of anger, but of sorrow. What kind of world had shaped this girl to believe kindness and equality didn't belong at 30,000 feet? Finally, Maya lifted her boarding pass from the seat pocket and held it out with calm precision. "This is my assigned seat. 4A, business class." Her tone was professional, steady, almost too quiet for the tension brewing around her. But Victoria didn't even glance at the boarding pass. Her lips curled in disdain. "Sometimes airlines make mistakes," Victoria said, her voice growing louder. "I'm sure the attendants can find you a more appropriate seat." The word appropriate landed like poison. Passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Everyone understood exactly what she meant. Chloe, encouraged by her mother's bravado, piped up again. "Yeah, you should move back. We're better than you. Just go." For the first time since boarding, Maya felt her composure tremble, not because of the insult itself, but because of what it revealed that a child, not yet old enough to know the complexities of the world, had already learned to dehumanize. The cycle was repeating itself, right in front of everyone. Maya closed her eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply, steadying her heartbeat. She heard her grandmother's voice again. "When they try to tear you down, stand taller." She opened her eyes, her gaze steady, her voice firm yet calm. "This is my seat," she said, more clearly this time, "and I'll be staying here." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The confrontation had begun, and the entire cabin knew it was only the beginning. Long before Maya Henderson found herself sitting in seat 4A of Flight 729, long before the world expected her to defend her right to exist in a space she had paid for, there was another girl, a little black girl growing up in the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, surrounded by railroad tracks, aging bridges, and a grandmother who carried the weight of an entire family on her shoulders. Maya was 8 years old when her parents died. A car accident on a rain-slicked highway changed everything in an instant. One moment she had been in the back seat, coloring in a book with her brother, and the next, she was waking up in a hospital bed to the news that her mother and father would never come home. Her brother survived, but was badly injured, and for a while, the silence between them was unbearable. Loss carved itself into Maya's childhood like an open wound that never quite healed. It was her grandmother, Evelyn Henderson, who became the anchor. Evelyn was a strong woman in every sense, short in stature, but towering in presence, with skin lined by years of labor and eyes that saw beyond hardship into possibility. She had worked as a seamstress for decades, raising 3 children on her own after her husband passed young, and when tragedy struck again, she stepped in without hesitation to raise her granddaughter and grandson. Evelyn wasn't wealthy. Their small house rattled when trains roared past, and some nights, dinner was a pot of beans stretched to its limits. But what she lacked in money, she made up for with wisdom and love. Every evening, after homework was done, Evelyn would sit Maya at the kitchen table with scraps of fabric, tools, or sometimes the newspaper, and teach her lessons about life. "Baby girl," she'd say, her voice steady, "you're going to build bridges, not walls. The world will try to tell you where you can't go. They'll try to knock down everything you make. That's when you stand taller. That's when you keep building." Those words became Maya's compass. She didn't always understand them as a child, but as she grew older, their meaning crystallized. Bridges weren't just structures of steel and concrete. They were symbols of connection, of resilience, of hope in the face of division. And Maya carried that lesson like a blueprint etched into her soul. School was never easy. Maya was bright, but classrooms weren't always welcoming. Teachers sometimes underestimated her, assuming she couldn't keep up. Classmates whispered, laughed, or excluded her from group projects. By middle school, she had learned to armor herself with silence, letting her grades speak louder than her voice. When other kids doodled in the margins of their notebooks, Maya sketched structures, arches, cables, spans stretching across rivers. She would trace the lines again and again, imagining how weight could be carried, how balance could be achieved. By the time she reached high school, she had discovered engineering. A teacher, Mr. Lawson, noticed her drawings one afternoon. Instead of dismissing them as idle sketches, he leaned over her desk and asked, "Have you ever thought about civil engineering? You might have the mind for it." It was the first time an adult outside her family had seen her talent, and it lit a fire inside her. College was another storm to weather. She earned a scholarship to Georgia Tech, one of the top engineering schools in the country. But the halls there echoed with the same doubts she had faced before, only louder and sharper. She was often one of the only black women in her lecture halls. Professors sometimes overlooked her hand in discussions. Classmates formed study groups without inviting her. She heard the whispers. She only got in because of diversity quotas. Each word stung, but each time she thought of Evelyn's voice. Build bridges, not walls. Stand taller. Keep building. So she did. She studied harder than anyone else, pulled all-nighters in the library, and worked part-time jobs to support herself. She became known not for being the only black woman in her cohort, but for her precision, her creativity, and her refusal to cut corners. Her senior project on earthquake-resistant bridges won a state award, and the moment she walked across the graduation stage, she clutched not just her diploma, but the sense that she had proven something not to the doubters, but to herself. Her career after college was a series of uphill climbs. She started at a mid-sized engineering firm where she was often mistaken for an assistant rather than a project lead. Clients sometimes spoke past her, directing questions to her male colleagues. But when deadlines came, it was Maya's calculations that saved projects. It was her foresight that identified structural weaknesses. Slowly, grudgingly, respect began to follow. Yet she knew every day that respect had to be earned twice over, once as an engineer, and once as a black woman in a field dominated by white men. Through it all, her grandmother remained her greatest supporter. Evelyn would call after long days, her voice warm through the phone. "Don't you let them shake you, baby girl. Remember what I told you. Bridges." Those calls reminded Maya that she wasn't just working for herself. She was working for the legacy of every person who had been told they didn't belong, for the communities too often left vulnerable when disaster struck. 3 years ago, Maya began her most ambitious project yet. She had grown restless, watching climate disasters devastate coastal towns, families losing homes, schools collapsing, entire neighborhoods underwater. She thought about her brother, now living near the Gulf Coast with his own children. She thought about her grandmother, who had passed away but whose words lived on. And she asked herself, what if bridges could do more than carry cars? What if they could carry communities through the storms? Her answer became a revolutionary design, a flood-resilient bridge capable of withstanding Category 5 hurricanes, engineered with materials that flexed rather than broke, and elevated to create safe passages even during catastrophic floods. She spent years developing the model, securing small grants, and running endless simulations. Piece by piece, she built not just a structure, but a vision of safety for millions. Now, as she sat in Seat 4A of Flight 729, that vision was in her briefcase. Pages of blueprints, calculations, and presentations ready for the summit in Seattle. If her design was approved, it could be implemented across the Pacific Northwest, protecting cities from the rising threats of climate change. It was her chance to honor her grandmother's promise, her chance to stand taller than every storm. And yet, despite all of that, despite the weight of her work and the resilience she carried, a stranger's voice had just tried to reduce her to nothing more than someone who didn't belong, a woman who didn't see the years of sacrifice, the brilliance, the humanity, only skin color. As Maya sat in that cabin, listening to Victoria Langford's entitled words and Chloe's parroting cruelty, she felt the clash of two worlds inside her. One world told her to shrink, to avoid confrontation, to survive quietly. The other told her to rise, to remember Evelyn's wisdom, to never let hatred dictate her place. Her palms pressed lightly against the armrest. She breathed deeply, steadying herself. She wasn't just carrying blueprints to Seattle. She was carrying every bridge she had ever dreamed of building, bridges her grandmother had believed in before the world even gave her a chance. And she silently vowed that no amount of prejudice, not even here at 30,000 feet, would tear them down. The storm was only beginning, but Maya was ready. Victoria Langford was the kind of woman who walked through the world as if gravity bent itself in her favor. People moved aside for her in grocery stores. Waiters rushed to refill her glass before it was empty. And teachers at her daughter's private academy always seemed to remember her name. She had grown accustomed to the kind of attention that wealth and a family name could buy, and she wielded it like a weapon wrapped in pearls. On the morning of Flight 729, she had already left a trail of exasperation behind her. At the check-in counter, she had demanded to know why her daughter, Chloe, wasn't seated directly beside her in first class. When the airline agent explained calmly that Victoria had only purchased a single first-class ticket and a separate business class seat for her daughter, Victoria made a show of sighing loudly, rolling her eyes, and hinting that her late husband had once worked with people high up in city government. The agent smiled politely, used to people like her, and repeated the seating arrangement as fact. Eventually, Victoria relented, but not without muttering about incompetence under her breath. In the lounge, she complained that the coffee was lukewarm, that the croissants weren't truly Parisian, that the seating wasn't comfortable enough for people accustomed to refinement. Her voice always carried just loud enough for others nearby to hear, as though she enjoyed recruiting an audience to her grievances. By the time boarding began, several staff members already recognized her as that passenger, the one who would inevitably test the patience of everyone on board. Walking down the jet bridge, Victoria adjusted her cashmere scarf and ushered Chloe along with a clipped tone. Chloe, clutching a small stuffed rabbit with ears worn thin from years of affection, trailed behind, her wide eyes scanning the airplane windows with curiosity. At 10 years old, Chloe had rarely flown outside of her family's luxury vacations. Her world was a curated bubble private schools, gated neighborhoods, and friends whose parents also belonged to the same social clubs. She had never really had to question her place in the world. Her mother's voice was her compass, and it pointed only toward privilege. As they stepped into the cabin, Victoria's eyes swept across the rows like a general inspecting her troops. She didn't just see seats, she saw hierarchies. To her, the plane was divided between those who belonged in luxury and those who merely stumbled into it. When her gaze landed on Maya Henderson, sitting calmly in 4A, reviewing her notes with quiet focus, something in Victoria snapped to attention. Her lips tightened, her nose wrinkled almost imperceptibly, and she came to a halt in the aisle. To most passengers, Maya looked like any successful professional, a well-tailored suit, neatly kept hair, posture of someone confident but not arrogant. To Victoria, however, Maya's very presence was an offense. She didn't see a civil engineer carrying the future of climate resilience in her briefcase. She didn't see years of sacrifice, education, or brilliance. What Victoria saw was a woman she had been conditioned to believe did not belong in business class. "Excuse me," she announced, her voice pitched just right so the nearby rows could hear. She tightened her grip on Chloe's shoulder and pulled her a step closer to the seat. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." Chloe looked up at her mother, confusion clouding her young face. What mistake? Mommy Victoria's eyes never left Maya. "This isn't your seat, sweetheart," she said sweetly to her daughter, though the words were intended as a dagger toward Maya. Some people don't always understand how these things work. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. One man, already buckled into his seat across the aisle, lowered his newspaper and frowned. A young woman in row 5 tilted her head, sensing the tension brewing. Even the flight attendant at the front paused her greeting as her ears caught the sharp edge in Victoria's tone. Chloe followed her mother's gaze and studied Maya, her brow furrowed in confusion. "But she's already sitting here," she whispered. "That's because she's confused," Victoria replied firmly, her voice carrying just enough to suggest authority. Then, louder, directed at Maya. "This is business class. I think you may have wandered into the wrong section." Maya looked up from her documents, her eyes steady, her demeanor calm. She didn't snap, didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for her boarding pass, unfolded it, and offered it without a word. The small rectangular slip clearly displayed her name, her flight number, and her assigned seat 4A, business class. No mistake, no confusion. But Victoria didn't even glance at it. She waved it off as though facts were irrelevant. "Sometimes the airline misprints. I'm sure the attendants can find you a more appropriate seat." The pause before the word appropriate lingered like smoke in the cabin. Everyone listening understood what she meant. Appropriate. A word soaked in centuries of exclusion. A word that built invisible walls. Chloe, eager to support her mother, echoed the lesson she had absorbed. "Yeah, you should sit in the back," she said innocently, clutching her stuffed rabbit closer. "We're better here." The cruelty wasn't in the malice of the child, because Chloe didn't fully know what she was saying, but in the inheritance of prejudice, passed down like an heirloom. The cabin fell quieter still, passengers now openly staring. A businessman in the front row shook his head. A woman 2 rows back gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. Inside, Maya's chest tightened. She had heard these words before in boardrooms, classrooms, and public spaces, yet hearing them from a child cut deeper, not because the insult was harsher, but because it revealed how early the poison was planted, how seamlessly prejudice was passed to the next generation. She thought of her grandmother's voice again. Build bridges, not walls. But what do you do when a child has been taught to see walls before they've ever seen a bridge for Victoria? However, this was just another performance. She stood taller, her heels clicking against the floor, certain she was defending not just her daughter's comfort, but some imagined social order. She looked around, seeking allies in the silent audience. But what she found instead were faces etched with disbelief and quiet disapproval. "Still," she pressed on. "Listen here," she said, her voice louder now, abandoning the thin veneer of politeness. "I don't know what kind of mistake this is, but this seat is not for you. My daughter is supposed to sit here, and I won't have her discomforted by this situation." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. The situation wasn't the seat assignment. It wasn't logistics or policy. It was the presence of a black woman in a space Victoria believed should be reserved for people like herself. Chloe tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, will she have to move when the captain comes?" Her voice was high, uncertain, but also hopeful, as if she trusted the world to reinforce what her mother had always told her, that they deserved more. Victoria smoothed her daughter's hair and smiled, confident. "Of course, darling. The captain will understand. People like us belong here." The words traveled through the cabin like a physical force, pressing down on every listener. The passengers now realized they weren't witnessing a minor seating dispute. They were witnessing prejudice unveiled without shame, prejudice passed from mother to daughter like a lesson in manners. And as the flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, and Maya sat rooted in her rightful seat, everyone sensed the tension building toward a breaking point. The cabin of Flight 729 had shifted into an almost unnatural stillness. It was as if the hum of the engines and the rustling of seat belts had dimmed, leaving only the sharp edge of tension hanging in the air. All eyes were now drawn to the confrontation between Victoria Langford and Maya Henderson. The passengers in business class, accustomed to a quiet cocoon of work and rest before takeoff, suddenly found themselves unwilling witnesses to a scene that felt both surreal and disturbingly familiar. Maya sat in her seat, boarding pass still held firmly in her hand. Her calm expression masked the storm churning inside her. She could feel the heat in her chest, the sting of humiliation that rose with every word from Victoria's lips. She knew this wasn't just about a chair. It was never about the seat itself. It was about belonging. It was about who was seen as worthy of sitting here and who was not. "I told you already," Victoria declared, her voice pitched high enough to command attention. "This isn't right. My daughter should not have to sit anywhere other than here. I don't know how this mistake happened, but it is clear as day that this seat is not for you." Maya held her gaze steady. She felt her fingers tremble slightly around the boarding pass, but refused to let it show. "This is my assigned seat. I purchased it. I am in 4A. If you have an issue, I suggest you speak with the flight crew." Her tone was calm, precise, and professional, like the way she presented her designs to skeptical committees. No extra words, no weakness, just fact. The problem was, facts were meaningless to people like Victoria Langford. "You think a slip of paper changes things?" Victoria scoffed. She let out a sharp laugh, scanning the nearby passengers as if rallying them to her cause. "No, no, no. I've traveled enough to know how these things work. Sometimes the system gets confused, but there are unspoken rules about who belongs in business class, about standards. I shouldn't have to explain them." The word standards carried venom. It was not just about etiquette. It was about exclusion. It was about drawing invisible lines to keep certain people out. Lines Maya had crossed her entire life just by daring to exist in spaces where some thought she didn't belong. Chloe, eager to echo her mother's authority, piped up again in her small but clear voice. "Mommy's right. She doesn't look like the people who sit up here. Why can't she move to the back? That's fair, isn't it?" The innocence in Chloe's face twisted the knife deeper. She wasn't cruel by nature. She was simply repeating what she had been taught, parroting prejudice in the way children recite nursery rhymes. That was what made it heartbreaking. Prejudice wasn't innate, it was inherited. Gasps and whispers rippled through the cabin. A businessman in row 2 shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." The young woman in row 5, who had been recording discreetly with her phone, shifted in her seat to get a clearer view. Even the elderly couple clasped hands tighter, their faces etched with quiet dismay. Maya inhaled deeply. She thought of her grandmother's words build bridges, not walls, but her chest burned with anger. Every instinct inside her wanted to rise, to shout, to remind Victoria Langford that she had no idea who she was speaking to, that she wasn't just some faceless passenger, but a woman who had dedicated her life to saving lives, to designing structures that would shield millions from storms. She wanted to tell her about the blueprints in her bag, about the meeting waiting in Seattle, about the bridges that could protect Chloe's own future. But another voice whispered back inside her, "Don't give them the reaction they want. Keep your dignity. Stand taller." So Maya steadied herself. "I am not moving," she said, her voice firm but calm. "I am sitting exactly where my ticket says I should be. I am not here to cause trouble. I am here to travel like any other passenger." Her refusal was quiet but resolute. It was a line drawn not in anger, but in dignity. Victoria's face flushed with indignation. She was not a woman accustomed to being told no, especially not in public. Her voice rose louder now, drawing the attention of more passengers and even one of the attendants near the galley. "This is absurd," Victoria snapped. "I will not sit here while my daughter is forced into discomfort. because the airline doesn't understand who belongs where. I pay good money for service, and I will not have my daughter exposed to this situation. The final word dripped with disdain. It wasn't a situation. It was a human being. She was dismissing, reducing Maya's presence to an inconvenience. The silence in the cabin was broken only by Chloe's small voice. "See, Mommy. She doesn't belong here. We're better than her. Just tell her to move." Those words hit like a physical blow. The passengers collectively stiffened. Some stared in shock, others with disgust. The businessman in row 2 muttered something sharper this time. "This is disgusting." A woman across the aisle pulled out her phone and began recording openly now. Inside, Maya's throat tightened. The child's words echoed like an ugly chorus, carrying the weight of a lesson passed down without question. For a brief moment, she felt her composure falter. She thought of all the times in her childhood when she had been told indirectly she didn't belong, teachers overlooking her hand, classmates excluding her from projects, professors questioning her abilities. The weight of those moments returned, pressing against her chest. But then she thought of Evelyn, her grandmother standing at the kitchen table, her hands calloused from sewing, her voice steady as steel. "The world will try to tear you down. That's when you stand taller." Maya straightened in her seat, her voice calm but clear enough for the cabin to hear. "I am not moving," she repeated. "This is my seat, and I have every right to be here." For the first time, there was strength in her tone that silenced the murmurs around her. Victoria's eyes widened, her face twisted in outrage. She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound menacing. "You don't understand. You are making this worse for yourself. This section is for people with standards, for people like us. You'd be far more comfortable in economy. Don't embarrass yourself." It was no longer coded. The racism was bare, unveiled, laid out for everyone to see. At that moment, the cabin seemed to split into two realities, one where Victoria believed she could still wield her privilege to bend the world around her, and another where passengers now realized they were watching a moment of injustice unfold right in front of them. Maya held her ground, her hands gripping her briefcase under the seat. She could feel her pulse racing, her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted desperately to disappear, to be left alone, but another part of her burned with defiance. She thought about Seattle, about the bridges, about the lives she could save, and she realized she couldn't afford to shrink here. If she surrendered this seat, she wouldn't just lose a chair. She would lose the principle her grandmother had spent her whole life teaching her. A voice finally broke through the growing storm. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" It was Elena Ruiz, the flight attendant, her face pale but professional as she approached the row. She had seen enough to know something was wrong, but she hadn't yet grasped the full scope of what was happening. Victoria immediately shifted her tone, adopting the voice of a victim. "Oh, thank goodness. Yes, there is a problem. This woman seems to be confused about her seating assignment, and she's making my daughter uncomfortable. I just want to make sure everyone is in their proper place." Elena's eyes shifted to Maya, who quietly held out her boarding pass once more. The attendant scanned it quickly, confirming seat 4A. "Ma'am, she is in her correct seat. This is her assignment." Victoria's lips tightened. She glanced around, aware that passengers were watching, that some were recording. But rather than back down, she pressed forward, lowering her voice but letting it drip with venom. "You don't understand. My daughter is used to a certain environment, a certain class of people. Surely you can see how this is disruptive." Elena's stomach twisted. She had heard many forms of passenger complaints, but this was different. This was raw prejudice. She steadied herself. All of our business class passengers have the same rights, regardless of background. If you're uncomfortable, perhaps we can find alternative arrangements for you. The words landed like a slap. For the first time, Victoria's composure faltered. Her eyes narrowed. Her jaw clenched. Alternative arrangements? For me? Do you know who my husband was? Do you know the people I'm connected to? This airline won't like where this goes. Elena did not flinch. She had been trained to handle difficult passengers, but inside, her pulse quickened. She knew this was beyond her authority now. She would need the captain. The stage was set. The cabin, the passengers, the growing tension, all of it was moving toward something larger. Maya sat silently, her dignity intact, but her heart still heavy. Victoria stood tall, convinced her privilege would shield her. Chloe looked between them, her small voice carrying lessons she didn't yet understand. And just beyond the cockpit door, Captain Daniel Brooks was about to enter, a man whose very presence would shift the balance of power in the cabin and whose words would leave everyone speechless. Maya Henderson sat frozen in her seat, though her posture remained upright and composed. On the surface, she looked calm, a picture of control. Inside, however, her mind was a battlefield. Every muscle in her body told her to push back harder, to speak louder, to remind Victoria Langford and everyone else on this plane that she belonged here. But another part of her whispered a different strategy, one she had learned through years of surviving spaces where she was told she did not belong. Stay calm. Do not let them see you break. Her fingers brushed the edge of her briefcase beneath her seat. Inside were the blueprints she had poured 3 years of her life into. Pages of calculations, diagrams, and models that could protect entire communities from floods and storms. The weight of her work steadied her for a moment. She reminded herself that she was here for something bigger than this confrontation. She had an appointment in Seattle that could change lives. That had to be her focus. Yet she could not silence the sting of Chloe's words. People like her should sit in the back. We are better than you. The cruelty of it was not in the malice, but in the innocence. The child had not invented those words. She had absorbed them, carried them like gospel passed from her mother. Maya's chest tightened. How many more children were out there, being taught the same? How many more generations would learn prejudice before they ever learned compassion? She thought of her grandmother again, Evelyn, the woman who had taught her that bridges were more than concrete. Evelyn had told her that some people would try to tear her down, not because of what she had done, but simply because of who she was. And when that happened, she had to stand taller. But standing taller in this moment felt like standing on quicksand. What did standing taller even look like when you were humiliated at 30,000 feet in front of strangers? Maya closed her eyes briefly. Feeling the thrum of the aircraft beneath her, she thought of the countless times she had faced moments like this. Moments where she had to decide whether to push back or hold her ground silently. In college, when a professor ignored her raised hand until a white male classmate repeated her exact question. At work, when clients shook hands with every man on her team, but walked past her as though she were invisible. In restaurants, when servers delivered the check to anyone else at the table, but her. Every time, she had faced a choice: react and risk being branded angry, or stay quiet and risk being erased. Either way, she lost something. Either way, her humanity was weighed on scales she had never asked to stand on. Now, Here she was again. Except this time, she wasn't in a boardroom or a classroom. She was on a plane with dozens of witnesses, many of them silent, some recording. The pressure was suffocating. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. She wondered what they saw. Did they see a woman unjustly harassed? Or did they see the caricature Victoria wanted them to see? Someone out of place, someone who did not belong. Her mind drifted to her brother, Marcus, living with his family near the Gulf Coast. He had 2 young children now, both under 12. What would he say if he knew his sister was being told to move to the back of a plane because of the color of her skin? He would be furious, protective, ready to defend her at all costs. But Marcus was not here. It was Maya alone. Maya and the legacy of Evelyn's words. Maya and the quiet strength she had carried her whole life. For a flicker of a moment, she considered giving in. She imagined herself gathering her things, standing quietly, and walking to economy. It would be easier. The confrontation would end. The stares would stop. She could close her eyes and pretend it never happened. A small voice whispered in her mind, "Just survive this. Just get to Seattle." But another voice rose louder, fiercer. "If you give in, you are telling every person in this cabin that they were right to treat you this way. You are telling Chloe that it is acceptable to strip someone of their dignity because of prejudice. You are betraying the bridges you promised to build." Her heart pounded. Sweat gathered at the nape of her neck. She gripped the armrest tighter, anchoring herself to the moment. This was not just a seat. This was a stand. Across the aisle. She noticed a man in a gray suit watching closely. His eyes flicked between her and Victoria. His jaw clenched as if he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure he should. Behind her, the young woman with the phone continued recording, her lips pressed into a thin line of determination. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, unwilling to get involved. The silence of the witnesses weighed heavily on Maya. She wondered what it would take for someone to speak. Did they not see the humiliation playing out before them? Or did they see and simply decide it wasn't their fight? The passivity of the crowd felt as sharp as Victoria's insults. It reminded her of history lessons about people who stayed silent when others were mistreated, convincing themselves it wasn't their place to intervene. Her mind replayed Chloe's words again and again. People like you. What did people like you mean? She knew the answer. It meant black. It meant woman. It meant not belonging in the places where privilege believed itself to be the only rightful occupant. She wanted to look Chloe in the eye and tell her the truth, that her skin was not a mistake, that she belonged here as much as anyone else. That one day, Chloe might grow up and regret the words her mother had taught her. But Maya could not. The child was not the enemy. The child was evidence of the enemy that lived in the teachings of adults. When Elena Ruiz, the flight attendant, confirmed that Maya was in her rightful seat, Maya felt a small flicker of relief. At least someone had acknowledged the truth. But the relief was short-lived. Victoria's response had been venomous, filled with threats about her husband's connections, about her influence. Maya had seen this tactic before, too. When prejudice failed, entitlement often turned into intimidation. She pressed her hands together in her lap, her mind spinning. How many more words would Victoria throw at her before the situation escalated further? How much longer before the captain himself was pulled into this? Maya felt the cabin tighten like a noose, every second heavier than the last. Her thoughts drifted again to her grandmother. Evelyn had never flown on an airplane in her life. She used to say the sky was for dreamers, and that one day Maya would fly higher than any bridge she could build. If Evelyn could see her now, sitting in seat 4A with people trying to strip her dignity, what would she say? Maya could almost hear her voice, steady and resolute. Don't let them decide your worth. Baby girl, you know who you are. Don't forget it. That memory steadied her. She looked at Victoria, who still stood in the aisle with her daughter, lips pressed tight with fury. She looked at Chloe, whose wide eyes flickered with confusion, even as she repeated her mother's cruelty. Then she looked at Elena Ruiz, who stood there with professionalism but also quiet support, her presence a lifeline in a storm. Maya realized that this was not just her fight. This was a moment the entire cabin was witnessing, a lesson unfolding in real time. If she yielded now, the lesson would be that power and privilege always won. If she stood firm, the lesson might be something else. She breathed deeply again, letting the air steady her heartbeat. This was not about anger. This was about dignity. She would not let them take that from her. When Elena stepped away to call the captain, Maya's pulse quickened again. Part of her dreaded his arrival. What if he sided with Victoria? What if authority turned against her, as it so often did in moments like this? But another part of her clung to hope. What if, this time, authority chose justice? Maya sat silently, her mind a whirl of fear and determination. She thought of Seattle, of the bridges, of the millions who might one day walk safely because of her work. She thought of Evelyn, of Marcus, of every child like Chloe who had been taught walls instead of bridges. And she whispered to herself in the quiet of her mind, "Stand taller." The engines hummed beneath the floor, steady and unchanging. The plane was ready for takeoff, but the cabin was not. A storm was building here, one as fierce as any hurricane Maya had studied, and she was at the center of it, carrying both the weight of her own dignity and the burden of what it meant for everyone watching. She didn't know what the captain would say when he arrived. She didn't know if the passengers would remain silent or if someone would finally speak up. But she knew one thing for certain. She was not moving. Not today. Not ever. The minutes stretched on like hours. Passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering in low voices, others watching intently. The air inside the cabin felt heavier with every passing second, charged with anticipation. Maya Henderson sat still, her fingers resting lightly on her briefcase, her face calm, though her heart thundered in her chest. She had already endured more humiliation than anyone should have to on a morning flight, but she knew the confrontation was far from over. Victoria Langford stood in the aisle like a queen, awaiting her due recognition. Her daughter Chloe at her side, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Victoria had demanded the captain, and now she waited with smug certainty. In her mind, there was no question how this would play out. Authority had always been in her favor. It always had before. Why should this be any different? The sound of footsteps echoed from the front of the plane. Firm, measured. Each step carried the weight of command. Heads turned as Captain Daniel Brooks emerged from the cockpit, his Navy uniform crisp, his posture tall, his presence filling the narrow aisle with an aura of authority that made the cabin fall silent. He was a man accustomed to command, a man who had faced storms in the sky and decisions where lives depended on his judgment. But more than that, he was a man who had lived through his own storms. Raised in the foster care system after losing his parents in a military accident, Daniel Brooks knew too well what it felt like to be treated as less than. That experience had carved into him a deep intolerance for injustice and a quiet but unshakable resolve to protect dignity wherever he found it threatened. He paused just before row 4, his gaze steady. He looked first at Victoria, who immediately straightened her scarf and turned on the charm she used at charity galas. "Oh, Captain. Thank goodness you're here," she began, her voice dripping with feigned relief. "We've had such an uncomfortable situation. This woman is in the wrong seat, and it's making my daughter very unsettled. I'm sure you can understand the importance of maintaining standards up here." Her words rang with entitlement, but Captain Brooks did not react immediately. He studied her, letting the silence stretch. Silence had power, and he wielded it deliberately. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying through the cabin with authority. "Ma'am, I understand there's been a dispute. I need you to explain to me exactly what the issue is." Victoria smiled as if the outcome were already decided. "It's really quite simple, Captain. My daughter and I have traveled extensively, and we are used to a certain level of refinement in business and first class. This passenger does not quite fit the usual clientele. I'm sure there's been a mix-up with her seat assignment." The captain's expression did not change, but his eyes flickered with something colder. "What specifically has this passenger done that is causing you discomfort?" Victoria hesitated. She waved her hand dismissively. "It's not about what she's done. It's about maintaining the proper atmosphere for premium passengers. Surely you understand." Before Captain Brooks could respond, Chloe's small voice cut through the silence. She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes and repeated what her mother had told her. "She doesn't look like she should be sitting here. People like her sit in the back." The words fell heavy in the cabin. A collective gasp rippled through the rows. A man muttered under his breath. Someone's phone camera caught the moment. And Maya felt the sting of those words pierce through her armor once again, though she kept her face composed. Captain Brooks looked down at Chloe, then back at her mother. He felt a surge of anger at the injustice unfolding before him, but tempered it with the calm discipline that had carried him through years of service. He turned his attention now to Maya. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice shifting into something respectful, something human. "I'm Captain Brooks. I want to make sure I understand. Would you mind telling me what you're traveling for today?" Maya blinked. She hadn't expected the captain to address her with dignity. Slowly, she spoke, her voice measured but carrying a quiet strength. "I'm traveling to Seattle for a meeting with state officials. I'm a civil engineer. I've developed a design for climate-resilient bridges that could protect coastal communities from flooding and hurricanes." The captain raised his eyebrows slightly, genuine interest flickering across his face. "That sounds like important work. How long have you been developing this design?" 3 years, Maya replied. "It's my life's work. My goal is to help millions of families stay safe during extreme weather events." Passengers leaned forward in their seats, hanging on her words. The businessman in row 2 nodded slowly, impressed. Even the young woman recording on her phone lowered it slightly, as if to fully take in the weight of what Maya was saying. Victoria shifted impatiently, her charm evaporating. "Captain, with all due respect, her personal business is irrelevant. The fact remains, she doesn't belong in this section, and it is making my daughter uncomfortable. Surely you can see that." But the captain ignored her, his focus still on Maya. "Thank you for sharing that with me. It takes a great deal of skill and dedication to develop something like that." Then he turned back to Victoria. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop as his demeanor hardened. His voice now carried the full authority of command. "Ma'am, let me be absolutely clear. This passenger is in her assigned seat, She has conducted herself with complete professionalism. The only person causing a disturbance in this cabin is you." The words struck like thunder. Passengers straightened in their seats, eyes wide. Victoria's confident smile faltered, confusion flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to argue, but Captain Brooks pressed forward, his tone sharp as steel. "Let's not insult anyone's intelligence here. I have been briefed on what was said. I have personally heard enough to know this is not about seat assignments. This is about prejudice, and I will not allow prejudice to dictate what happens on my aircraft." The word prejudice cut through the cabin like a blade. Victoria's face flushed deep red. She sputtered, "I never mentioned race. I only said—" The captain cut her off with precision. "You said she didn't belong here. Your daughter repeated it. You've made it very clear what you meant, and I will not tolerate it." He crouched slightly then, lowering himself to Chloe's eye level. His voice softened, not for Victoria, but for the child. "Chloe, I want you to listen carefully. The woman sitting in that seat is one of the smartest people on this airplane. She builds bridges that can keep families safe during storms. That makes her a hero. And when you say people like her don't belong, you are saying heroes don't belong. That is not true. Do you understand?" Chloe's wide eyes brimmed with confusion. She clutched her rabbit tighter. No one had ever contradicted her mother in this way. She looked at Maya, then back at the captain, trying to process this new truth. Victoria bristled, her voice rising. "How dare you speak to my daughter like that? Do you know who my husband was? He had connections in city planning, people who could make trouble for this airline." Captain Brooks stood to his full height, towering over her. His eyes locked on hers, his tone unyielding. "I don't care who your husband was. I don't care what connections you think you have. On this aircraft, the only thing that matters is that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect. And right now, you are the one violating both." A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nodded. Others whispered words of agreement. Maya sat in stunned silence, her throat tight with emotion. For once, authority was not against her. For once, someone in power was standing on her side. The captain straightened his shoulders. "You have two choices. You can apologize to Ms. Henderson, take your assigned seats, and remain silent for the rest of this flight. Or you and your daughter can be removed from this aircraft, placed on a no-fly list, and find your own way to Seattle. The choice is yours." Gas swept through the cabin. Victoria's mouth fell open. She was used to bending rules, to intimidating her way through obstacles. Never had she been given such an ultimatum. Never had authority stood so firmly against her entitlement. She faltered, for the first time. The power she carried like a crown slipped from her grasp. And as the seconds ticked by, all of business class watched to see whether the woman who believed herself untouchable would finally face consequences. The cabin had never been so quiet. Even the steady drone of the engine seemed muted under the weight of the captain's words. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, some clutching armrests, others holding phones mid-air, recording every second. All of business class waited to see how this entitled mother would respond to the ultimatum. Victoria Langford's face cycled through disbelief, outrage, and fear. She had spent her life wielding privilege like a shield, convinced that rules bent for her. But here, in front of dozens of witnesses, that shield had shattered. For the first time, authority was not on her side. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked around desperately, searching the cabin for sympathy, but found only eyes filled with disapproval and disgust. Chloe tugged softly at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why is everyone staring at us?" Her small fingers clutched her rabbit tighter, her confusion etched clearly on her face. She had grown up in a world where her mother's voice was law. Now that law was being dismantled in real time, and Chloe didn't know what to believe. Victoria's cheeks flushed crimson. She turned back to Captain Brooks, her voice rising in a shrill pitch. "You can't do this to me. I am a first-class passenger. I have rights. You don't understand who you're dealing with. My family has influence. We will see to it that this airline regrets humiliating me." Captain Brooks stood immovable, his eyes unwavering. "Your rights end where another passenger's dignity begins. You have 60 seconds to make your choice." The countdown was silent but deafening. Every tick of the invisible clock pressed harder on Victoria's chest. She glanced at Chloe again, saw the uncertainty in her daughter's eyes, and for the first time, doubt crept into her own. Maya Henderson sat quietly in her seat, her hands folded neatly over her briefcase. On the outside, she was composed, but inside her pulse raced. She had not expected the captain to defend her with such moral certainty. She felt a rush of relief, but also a strange heaviness. The humiliation she had endured still lingered, a bruise that no apology could erase. Yet the possibility of justice glimmered in front of her. Fragile and fleeting, the businessman across the aisle shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "About time someone stood up to this nonsense." The young woman recording kept her camera steady, her lips pressed tight. Other passengers exchanged looks, silently acknowledging that they were witnessing something larger than a simple seating dispute. Victoria's composure began to crack. Her voice faltered. This is ridiculous. I was only trying to protect my daughter. Surely you can understand that." "No," Captain Brooks replied firmly, his tone final. "What you were doing was teaching your daughter that it is acceptable to strip someone of their dignity because of the color of their skin. That is not protection. That is prejudice." Gas rippled again through the cabin. The word prejudice was like a verdict, spoken not just to Victoria, but to everyone listening. There was no hiding behind vague language now. It was named, undeniable, laid bare in the open. Victoria's breathing quickened. She felt trapped, cornered by truth. Her usual tactics of charm and intimidation useless. The captain's authority was absolute, his words striking with precision. Her eyes darted to the flight attendants who stood nearby, their expressions firm and resolute, clearly siding with him. She realized then that she was alone. Chloe's voice wavered again. "Mommy, why won't you just say sorry to the bridge lady? She helps people. The captain said so." The innocence in her daughter's plea cut deeper than any of the captain's words. For a moment, Victoria's defenses crumbled. She looked at Maya, really looked at her for the first time, not as an intruder, not as a mistake, but as a woman sitting calmly in her rightful place, a woman who had endured humiliation with dignity, a woman who carried something powerful, though Victoria did not yet fully understand it. The seconds ticked away. Captain Brooks's voice cut through once more, low but firm. 30 seconds. Victoria's throat tightened. She realized she had only two paths cling to pride and face the humiliation of being escorted off the plane, or surrender and speak the words that felt like ashes on her tongue. Her lips trembled. The words stuck in her throat. She swallowed hard, her face pale. "I'm sorry." The apology was whispered, weak, a shadow of contrition. But Captain Brooks was not finished. His eyes held hers with unwavering command. "That is not enough. I need you to be specific, and I need you to address Ms. Henderson directly." The passengers leaned forward again, the silence thick. Victoria's pride screamed at her to resist, but her daughter's tearful eyes and the captain's unyielding presence left her no choice. She turned slowly, her voice trembling with shame. "Ms. Henderson," she began, the words tasting bitter. "I apologize for my behavior. I was wrong to say you didn't belong here. I was wrong to involve my daughter. I was wrong to judge you based on your race." The confession hung in the air like a public reckoning. Some passengers nodded quietly in approval. Others remained skeptical, their expressions hard. Apologies offered under duress often rang hollow, but the significance of the moment was not lost on anyone. A woman who had spent her life avoiding accountability was finally forced to name her prejudice aloud. Maya listened in silence. Her throat tightened, her chest heavy. She had endured humiliation, and now she was being offered an apology. But what did an apology mean in the face of centuries of wounds? She nodded once, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you for your apology. I accept it. I hope your daughter learns that every person deserves respect." The words were gracious, but inside, Maya wrestled with mixed emotions. Part of her wanted to accept fully, to believe that even small apologies could lead to change. Another part of her ached with doubt, certain that the apology was born more of fear than understanding. But she chose grace, not for Victoria, but for herself. Grace was the bridge she could build in this moment. Captain Brooks straightened, his voice rising slightly as he addressed the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, let this be clear. Discrimination has no place on this flight, nor should it in our society. Each of us has a choice when we witness injustice, to stay silent or to stand up. Today, you've seen what standing up looks like." The businessman across the aisle began to clap. Slowly, others joined. Applause spread through the cabin, filling the air with a thunderous sound that made Victoria's face burn crimson. Chloe looked around wide-eyed, clutching her rabbit as if trying to understand why the passengers clapped not for her mother, but for the woman she had been taught to dismiss. Victoria sat down abruptly in her assigned seat, 3 rows back, her shoulders hunched, her face turned away from the crowd. Chloe followed, still glancing at Maya with curiosity and something new, something softer than before. Maya remained in her seat, her eyes glistening. She pressed her hands lightly over her briefcase, drawing strength from the knowledge that she had not moved, that she had stood her ground. The weight of humiliation still lingered, but alongside it now was something else, a quiet affirmation of her dignity. Captain Brooks gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of respect, before turning back toward the cockpit. His footsteps faded down the aisle, but the echo of his words remained, carved into the memory of every passenger on board. The ultimatum had been delivered. The apology had been spoken. But the lesson, Maya knew, was far from over. For Chloe, for Victoria, for every silent witness in that cabin, the confrontation was now part of their story too. And as the applause died down, Maya whispered to herself, "Steady and resolute. Stand taller." The storm inside the cabin had broken, but the air was still heavy with its aftermath. As Captain Daniel Brooks returned to the cockpit, the applause faded slowly, leaving behind a hum of hushed conversations and the lingering echo of what had just unfolded. Victoria Langford sat stiffly in her assigned seat 3 rows back, her face pale and tight, her hands gripping the armrests as if she could squeeze dignity back into her veins. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. The eyes of strangers burned into her, not with admiration as she was accustomed to, but with judgment and disappointment. She tried to hold her chin high, but the shame weighed on her shoulders like a stone. Chloe sat beside her, the stuffed rabbit still pressed against her chest. Her young mind churned with confusion. Everything she had been taught about who belonged where had been dismantled in minutes. The captain's words rang in her ears. The woman in that seat is a hero, a builder of bridges. Heroes belong anywhere. She looked forward toward Maya Henderson's row, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Maya herself sat quietly in 4A, her hands folded over her briefcase, her heart still pounding, though her expression remained calm. She had survived the confrontation, but she was not unscathed. The humiliation still stung. It was not erased by the apology, nor by the applause, but there was something else now, something steadier, a recognition that she had held her ground, that she had not let hatred force her to move. Her thoughts wandered to Evelyn, her grandmother, and the kitchen table where she first learned about structures, foundations, and standing tall against the forces that try to knock you down. Some folks will try to tear you apart just for existing, Evelyn had said. When that happens, you remember who you are. You stand taller. Maya had carried those words her whole life, but never had they felt so immediate, so alive. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, extending his hand. Ms. Henderson, he said warmly. My name is Richard Coleman. I work with the state's infrastructure division. If you would be open to it, I'd love to hear more about your designs when we land. What you're doing sounds like exactly what we need. Maya blinked, caught off guard. She reached out and shook his hand, her grip steady despite the emotion surging inside her. Thank you, she replied softly. That means a great deal to me. Behind her, the young woman who had been recording the incident slid her phone into her bag and leaned forward. I'm Emily Chen, she said. I write for an online magazine. I want people to hear your story, both what happened here and the work you're doing. If you're willing, I'd love to interview you. Maya's throat tightened. She had boarded this plane to travel quietly to a meeting in Seattle, focused only on her blueprints. Now, strangers were offering her new platforms, new opportunities. It felt surreal, almost overwhelming. But there was also a spark of possibility. Perhaps what had begun as humiliation could be transformed into something greater. Passenger by passenger, the wall of silence that had hung over the confrontation crumbled. A woman in row 5 leaned forward and said, You handled yourself with so much grace. I don't know if I could have stayed as calm as you did. An older man further back nodded and added, You showed more dignity in the last 30 minutes than most of us show in a lifetime. Maya listened, her heart swelling with both gratitude and weariness. The kindness soothed some of the sting, but she couldn't forget how long the silence had lasted before anyone spoke. She wondered how many of these same people would have stayed quiet had the captain not intervened. That thought lingered like a shadow, reminding her of how fragile justice could be when left in the hands of bystanders. Still, she offered a small smile to each person who spoke. Thank you, she said again and again, choosing grace even in her exhaustion. Chloe, unable to contain her curiosity any longer, tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. Mommy, she whispered, can I go talk to her? Victoria stiffened. No, she hissed under her breath. Sit still. But Chloe's eyes remained fixed on Maya. Her mind was filled with questions, her heart heavy with guilt. The words she had repeated from her mother people, like you should sit in the back, echoed painfully in her young conscience. The captain had called Maya a hero. Heroes deserved respect, not scorn. The contradiction tore at her 10-year-old certainty. When the meal service began, Chloe seized her chance. She slipped out of her seat and walked hesitantly down the aisle toward row 4, her stuffed rabbit dangling from her hand. She stopped at Maya's side, her voice small and trembling. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you really a hero?" Maya turned surprised. She looked at the little girl standing there, the same child who had repeated her mother's cruel words with such innocence. Maya's first instinct was to turn away, to protect herself from more pain. But then she saw the vulnerability in Chloe's eyes, the way her small fingers twisted in the fabric of her rabbit. This wasn't malice. This was a child caught between two worlds of belief. Maya softened her voice. "I don't know if I'd call myself a hero. I'm an engineer. I design bridges to keep people safe during storms." Chloe's eyes widened. "So when it rains really hard, your bridges help people get away?" "Yes," Maya said gently. "That's the goal, to make sure families have a safe way to escape floods." Chloe nodded slowly, her mind absorbing this new truth. "That sounds like what heroes do. They help people." Maya felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to be angry at the child, to remember the sting of her earlier words. But instead, she saw possibility. If prejudice could be taught, perhaps it could also be unlearned. Perhaps a bridge could be built here too. "You're very kind to say that," Maya replied softly. "Do you like building things?" Chloe's face brightened with curiosity. "Yes, I like drawing houses. Sometimes I make little bridges with my blocks, but they always fall down." Maya smiled, reaching for a napkin from her tray table. She pulled out a pen and began to sketch a simple diagram, showing how triangles gave strength to a bridge. If you build like this, with strong shapes, your bridges won't fall so easily. Chloe studied the sketch, her eyes wide with wonder. "Wow, that's so cool. Thank you." Victoria watched from her seat 3 rows back, her face tight with conflicting emotions. She wanted to pull her daughter back, to end the conversation, to reclaim the control she had lost. But something in her daughter's bright eyes and eager voice stopped her. For the first time in a long while, Victoria saw her child engaged, curious, respectful of knowledge rather than status. It was both humbling and unsettling. Maya folded the napkin and handed it to Chloe. "Here, keep this. Maybe you'll build bridges one day, too." Chloe clutched the napkin as if it were a treasure. "Thank you," she said softly. Then, with the innocence of a child trying to right a wrong, she added, "I'm sorry about what I said before. I didn't really mean it. I thought that's how things were supposed to be." The sincerity in her small voice pierced Maya's heart. She nodded gently. "Thank you for saying that. What matters is what you choose to believe now." Chloe smiled shyly before returning to her seat, napkin in hand. The passengers who had watched the exchange were quiet, but their faces reflected something deeper now. They had not only seen prejudice confronted, they had seen the possibility of change, the fragile moment where a child chose to step away from the hatred she had been taught. Maya leaned back in her seat, her eyes moist, her heart heavy but hopeful. She realized that what had happened was bigger than her, bigger than Victoria, bigger even than the captain's intervention. It was about what could grow from this moment, what bridges could be built from the rubble of humiliation. As the plane soared westward towards Seattle, the hum of the engines returned to the forefront, steady and constant. Yet inside the cabin, nothing felt the same. Every passenger carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed. Some carried guilt for their silence. Some carried admiration for the captain's leadership. Some carried newfound respect for Maya's strength. And Chloe carried a napkin with a drawing of a bridge. Her first lesson in building something strong enough to withstand storms. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin again. But the atmosphere was changed, charged with something more profound than routine air travel. Passengers were no longer absorbed in laptops, newspapers, or half-hearted conversation. They had witnessed something raw and unforgettable, and it lingered in the air like static before a storm. Maya Henderson leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed for a moment, trying to collect herself. Though she appeared calm, her body still carried the residue of adrenaline. Every muscle was tense, every thought tangled. She had survived humiliation, endured scrutiny, and somehow stood taller through it all. But the cost of composure was heavy, like carrying stones inside her chest. The napkin sketch she had drawn for Chloe still sat on the child's tray table, 3 rows back. Maya wondered if Chloe would keep it, or if her mother would crumple it in anger once the plane landed. That thought pricked at her heart. Children were clay, soft and impressionable. What would this day shape Chloe into? Maya's thoughts were interrupted by Richard Coleman, the businessman who had first extended his hand earlier. He stood up now, walking down the narrow aisle with a confidence that carried the weight of his position. He stopped beside Maya's seat, lowering his voice out of respect. "Ms. Henderson," he began, "I want you to know how deeply impressed I am, not only with your composure during what just happened, but with your work. I meant what I said earlier. I oversee infrastructure projects for Washington State. The kind of resilience you're describing in your bridge design is exactly what our coastal communities need. When we land, would you be open to discussing this further?" Maya blinked, stunned. She had boarded this plane fearing nothing more than her presentation to state officials. Now, here was another door opening, unexpected and unlooked for. She gathered her composure. "Yes," she said softly. "I would be honored to discuss it." Richard smiled warmly. "Good. I'll arrange a meeting with our resilience committee. People need to hear what you have to offer. It is not often we meet someone with both vision and the courage to carry it forward." His words struck her. Courage. She had not thought of herself as courageous sitting in that seat. She had thought only of survival, of not surrendering her dignity. But perhaps that was courage, too. As Richard returned to his seat, Maya noticed the journalist, Emily Chen, waiting nearby. She approached with her notebook in hand, her expression both professional and empathetic. "I know this might feel overwhelming," Emily said gently, "but I think people need to hear your story, both what happened here today and the work you're doing. Would you allow me to interview you when we land? I promise to tell it with care." Maya hesitated. The thought of her humiliation becoming a public spectacle made her chest tighten. She had spent her life trying to avoid attention, focusing instead on her work. But then she thought of Evelyn's words again. Build bridges, not walls. Perhaps telling her story was another kind of bridge. She nodded slowly. "Yes, but please, make sure the focus is on the work. The bridges are what matter." Emily smiled knowingly. "Of course, but people also need to see the strength behind the work. That is what inspires change." Maya exhaled, both anxious and grateful. She could not yet imagine how far Emily's article would spread, but she sensed that this was not just about a story on a plane. This was about reshaping conversations in living rooms and classrooms across the country. A flight attendant passing by offered Maya a glass of water, her eyes filled with quiet respect. "You handled yourself with such grace," Elena Ruiz said softly. "I just want to say I'm sorry you had to go through that. And I'm grateful for how you carried yourself. You reminded me why standing up matters." Maya felt her throat tighten. She accepted the glass with a small nod. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Around the cabin, the passengers who had once sat frozen in silence began to approach in small waves. A woman in her 30s leaned over the aisle. "I was recording," she admitted. "At first, I thought I should just stay quiet. But then I realized silence is part of the problem. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." An older man with silver hair nodded from across the row. "You showed everyone here what dignity looks like. I will not forget that." Their words poured over Maya like a tide. Gratitude, apologies, admiration. Each one chipped away at the heaviness in her chest, though not all the way. She appreciated their kindness, but she also knew that in the moment of confrontation, most had stayed silent. The weight of that truth remained. Still, she chose to respond with grace. "Thank you," she said again and again, her voice calm. She did not lash out, though part of her wanted to ask why it took so long for them to see her humanity. She carried that question quietly in her heart, knowing it was larger than this cabin, larger than any one flight. Chloe, meanwhile, sat in her seat staring at the napkin bridge as though it were a treasure map. She traced the lines with her small finger, her mind alive with curiosity. She turned to her mother, her voice quiet but insistent. "Mommy, she builds things that keep people safe. Why did you say she didn't belong here?" Victoria froze. Her throat tightened, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The question pierced her deeper than any of the captain's words. She wanted to brush it off, to tell her daughter she had misunderstood, but she could not. The image of her daughter looking up at Maya with admiration was burned into her mind. And for the first time, Victoria wondered if perhaps the prejudice she had carried so easily was poisoning not only strangers, but her own child. She whispered, "I was wrong. Chloe." The words were barely audible, almost swallowed by the hum of the engines. Chloe turned toward her, eyes wide, as if hearing her mother admit wrong was as rare as seeing the stars up close. Maya caught the exchange in the reflection of the window. She felt a flicker of something unexpected. Compassion. She did not forgive Victoria for her cruelty, not yet. But she saw the cracks forming, the possibility that change could grow from shame. That, too, was a kind of bridge. As the plane soared westward over mountains and rivers, Maya thought of her meeting in Seattle. She thought of Evelyn's hands pointing to blueprints on the kitchen table. She thought of Marcus and his children near the Gulf Coast. And she thought of Chloe, holding a napkin sketch like it was a key to a new world. For the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself to imagine the future not as something threatened, but as something expanded. A future where her designs could save lives. A future where Chloe might grow into someone who built bridges of her own, not just in steel and concrete, but in compassion and understanding. The plane carried them closer to Seattle, closer to her destiny. But Maya knew the real journey had already begun. It had begun the moment she refused to move. The descent began with a familiar chime overhead, a gentle announcement from the cabin speakers reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for landing. But this was no ordinary landing. The atmosphere in business class was still heavy with the weight of what had happened. No one would forget the confrontation, nor the captain's words that had cut like lightning through prejudice. Maya Henderson looked out the window at the vast expanse of clouds breaking apart to reveal the jagged peaks of the Cascades below. Seattle sprawled somewhere beyond those mountains, waiting for her with the most important presentation of her life. Yet as the plane angled downward, she knew she was arriving with more than blueprints and calculations. She carried a story now, one she had not asked for, but one that could no longer be hidden. Passengers whispered softly to each other, some still sneaking glances toward Maya. A few nodded respectfully when her eyes met theirs, silent acknowledgments of admiration or guilt. Others looked away quickly, embarrassed by their own silence earlier. Chloe Langford shifted in her seat, the napkin with the bridge sketch clutched tightly in her small hands. She had not let it go since Maya had drawn it for her. Every so often she traced the lines with her fingertip, whispering explanations to her stuffed rabbit as though teaching it about triangles and strength. Beside her, Victoria Langford sat rigid, her eyes fixed out the window, her pride cracked but not fully broken. She had apologized, yes, but the humiliation clung to her skin like an unwashable stain. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, the roar of reverse thrusters filling the cabin. Passengers shifted, gathering bags, phones buzzing back to life as the plane taxied toward the terminal. For Maya, the familiar chime signaling the end of the flight carried a different weight. She braced herself for what awaited beyond the cabin doors. As the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the seatbelt signs switched off, and the aisle filled with the usual shuffle of passengers eager to disembark. But this time, instead of rushing toward the exit, a line formed in the aisle beside Maya's row. One by one, passengers stopped to speak to her. Richard Coleman was first. He placed a card in her hand, his expression steady. "My team will want to hear from you as soon as possible. Let's set a meeting tomorrow. Seattle needs people like you." Next came Emily Chen, notebook in hand. "I'll be in touch later today. I'll make sure your work is the focus. People deserve to know both your story and your solutions." Others followed with small words of encouragement, offers of business contacts, or simply quiet nods of respect. A young woman with a laptop whispered, "I was silent too long today. I'll remember this. Thank you for standing tall." Maya accepted each word with a calm smile, though her chest was tight. The attention was overwhelming, and part of her longed for nothing more than to disappear into anonymity. But another part of her recognized the weight of what was happening. She was no longer just Maya the engineer. She was becoming Maya the symbol, and that realization both frightened and strengthened her. Chloe approached once more, tugging gently at Maya's sleeve as Victoria lingered reluctantly behind her. "Dr. Henderson," the child said softly, her voice wavering with both guilt and admiration. "Will you build a bridge in Seattle, too, so people here can be safe?" Maya's eyes softened. She knelt slightly so she could meet Chloe's gaze. "That's what I hope. Chloe, to build bridges that protect families everywhere. But the most important bridges we build are between people. Bridges of understanding. Do you know what I mean?" Chloe nodded solemnly, her young face thoughtful. "Like between me and you," Maya smiled. "Exactly. Between you and me." Victoria stepped forward, her voice low, her pride cracking further under the eyes of the watching passengers. "Ms. Henderson, I know words may not mean much after what I said, but I need to tell you again. I was wrong. Seeing my daughter look up to you, seeing her listen when she never listens to me, it forced me to realize how poisoned my thinking has been. I am ashamed." Maya studied her for a long moment. She saw the redness in Victoria's cheeks, the tremor in her hands. She also saw that the apology was not polished, not wrapped in the usual arrogance of entitlement. It was rough, raw, and reluctant, but perhaps real. "Thank you," Maya said finally. "What matters most is what you do next, not just what you say." Victoria's eyes glistened. She gave a small nod, then guided Chloe gently back toward the aisle. The passengers slowly streamed off the plane, but when Maya reached the jet bridge, she was surprised to find cameras waiting. Emily Chen had clearly wasted no time. Other passengers who had recorded the confrontation had already uploaded clips to social media, and by the time Flight 729's doors opened, the story was spreading. Reporters clustered near the gate, their voices overlapping as microphones pointed in her direction. "Maya, can you tell us what happened on board Ms. Henderson? How did you stay so calm when confronted with that level of prejudice? Are you planning to take action against the airline or the other passenger?" Maya froze, overwhelmed by the flash of cameras and the flood of questions. She had not expected this storm. Not here. Not so soon. Captain Daniel Brooks appeared beside her, his tall frame cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. He raised a hand, his voice calm but commanding. "Give her space. She is a passenger, not a spectacle." The reporters quieted, some stepping back reluctantly. The captain leaned close to Maya, his voice lower. "You don't have to say anything right now. Take your time. Protect your peace." Maya nodded, gratitude surging through her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Richard Coleman appeared again, ushering her past the cluster of reporters. "Come with me," he said. "We'll get you to your meeting. You'll have plenty of time to decide how to handle the media later." As they walked through the terminal, Maya's phone buzzed relentlessly in her bag. Text messages from colleagues, notifications from social media, calls from unknown numbers. The incident had already gone viral. The clip of Captain Brooks declaring, "The only person out of place is you," had spread like wildfire, shared across platforms with captions celebrating dignity and condemning prejudice. By the time Maya reached baggage claim, she had hundreds of messages waiting. Old classmates reaching out, strangers offering words of encouragement, organizations requesting interviews. It was dizzying. She sat on a bench near the carousel, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the terminal fade. This was supposed to be a quiet trip for a presentation. Now it was something else entirely, something larger than she could have imagined. Richard sat beside her, speaking gently. "This could be overwhelming, but it could also be an opportunity. Your designs deserve attention. Your story could amplify that work. The question is, how do you want to move forward?" Maya opened her eyes, staring at the stream of passengers collecting their bags. She thought of Evelyn, of Chloe, of the captain's unyielding voice. She thought of bridges structures that connected and carried, built to withstand storms. Perhaps this was her storm to withstand, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed to see that dignity could hold. "I'll move forward carefully," she said at last, "but I won't let fear silence me. Not this time." Richard nodded approvingly. "Good. Then let's start by making sure your meeting tomorrow isn't just another presentation. Let's make it a turning point." Maya breathed deeply, feeling the weight of both fear and purpose settle in her chest. Outside, the sky over Seattle was gray, the city damp with mist, but she knew that inside those clouds, Sunlight waited to break through. The morning light over Seattle was pale and silvery, filtered through low clouds that clung to the city's skyline. Maya Henderson stood at the window of her hotel room, staring out at the water that stretched beyond the harbor. Her briefcase sat on the desk behind her, blueprints neatly tucked inside, the culmination of years of work. Today was the day she had been preparing for. Today, she would present her designs to the state committee, a chance to bring her bridges from paper into reality. But she knew she carried more than engineering plans into that meeting. She carried the weight of yesterday's flight, the viral videos, the messages flooding her phone, the confrontation that had tried to strip her dignity and the captain's response that had restored it. She carried it all like invisible luggage. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her tired but steady. She whispered to herself, as she had many times before big moments, "Stand taller." Downstairs, Richard Coleman was waiting with his usual air of calm authority. He greeted her with a warm smile. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Maya replied, though her stomach churned with nerves. The state committee chambers were a stark contrast to the plane cabin. A long polished table, officials seated with laptops and notepads, screens ready to display her blueprints. Yet as she walked into the room, she felt the same weight of scrutiny, the same need to prove she belonged. Emily Chen was there too, not as a participant, but as an observer, notebook ready, watching closely. Her presence reminded Maya that whatever happened in this room could extend far beyond it. Richard made the introductions, then stepped aside as Maya placed her briefcase on the table and opened it carefully. She spread out her designs, the drawings crisp, precise, alive with her vision. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My name is Maya Henderson. I am a civil engineer, and I am here to present a bridge design built not just to connect places, but to protect lives." She walked them through the diagrams: reinforced foundations resistant to erosion, triangular supports designed to withstand both earthquakes and floods, elevated structures to allow rising waters to pass safely beneath. She spoke not just of calculations, but of people, the families who would be able to evacuate during storms, the communities that would remain connected when floods cut off the roads. As she spoke, the room leaned in. The officials asked questions sharp, technical, demanding, but Maya met each one with confidence, born from years of preparation. She had tested every calculation, studied every possible failure. She answered with clarity, her hands moving across the diagrams as though she were sculpting possibility itself. And then, unexpectedly, her voice softened. "These designs aren't just numbers on a page to me. They are a promise. When I was a girl, my grandmother taught me that engineers build structures to keep people safe. She told me, 'Maya, you will build bridges, not walls. And when people try to tear you down, you will stand taller.' That's why I am here, to honor that promise, to stand taller, not just for myself, but for every family who needs safety when the storms come." The room was silent for a moment, not with disinterest, but with something deeper: respect. An older committee member finally spoke. "Ms. Henderson, your design is not only innovative, but timely. Our coastlines are changing, and we need infrastructure that anticipates the future, not just reacts to disaster. What you're offering could be exactly what we've been searching for." Richard gave a small, approving nod from his seat in the back. Another official asked, "What kind of support would you need to bring this from blueprint to reality?" Maya inhaled deeply, then answered with precision funding estimates, pilot locations, a phased rollout plan. She had prepared for this question. She knew the stakes. By the time she finished, the room was buzzing with conversation, heads bent over her blueprints, voices low but filled with energy. Richard leaned over to whisper, "You did it. They're listening." Maya exhaled, relief washing over her. Yet in the midst of her relief, her thoughts flickered back to Chloe. The little girl's face, wide-eyed as she traced the napkin sketch. The question she had asked, like between me and you, it haunted her in the best way. She realized then that this presentation wasn't just about steel and concrete. It was about building bridges of understanding, too. After the meeting, Richard approached her, beaming. "They're moving forward. They want to fund a pilot project. Seattle will be the first to implement your design." Maya's knees almost buckled. Years of late nights, endless calculations, self-doubt, and persistence had led to this moment. Her work would no longer sit folded in a briefcase. It would rise into the world, a structure of strength and protection. Emily Chen approached next, her expression soft. "That was incredible," she said. "I know the world will want to hear this story not just of the bridges, but of you. Yesterday showed your dignity. Today showed your brilliance. Together, that is a narrative people need to see." Maya smiled faintly, overwhelmed but grateful. "Just promise me, the bridges don't get lost in the noise." "They won't," Emily said firmly. "They'll shine even brighter." As Maya stepped out of the building, the Seattle air was cool and damp, the sky beginning to break open with streaks of sunlight. For the first time in days, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. Across town, in a hotel room not far away, Chloe Langford was drawing. Victoria sat at the desk, scrolling through headlines about the incident on Flight 729. Each article cut into her pride, but each one also chipped away at her blindness. She had watched the video clips, heard the captain's words repeated again and again online. She saw herself not as she wanted to be, but as she had been angry, entitled, cruel. The mirror was not flattering, but it was honest. Meanwhile, Chloe sat on the carpet with crayons scattered around her, sketching a large bridge arcing over blue waves. On the bridge she drew tiny stick figures, families holding hands, children smiling. At the top she wrote in blocky letters, "Thank you, Maya." Victoria looked over at her daughter, watching her brow furrow in concentration. "That's beautiful. Chloe," she said softly, her voice carrying a tenderness rarely heard. Chloe looked up. "Mommy, when I grow up, I want to build bridges like her. Not just for storms, for people too." Victoria's throat tightened. She felt tears press against her eyes, tears she had not allowed herself in years. In that moment, she realized the confrontation on the plane had not only humiliated her, it had saved something in her daughter. It had cracked open a new path, one she herself had almost destroyed. She whispered, "Then you will. Chloe, you'll build something better than I ever did. For Maya, miles away." The day ended with her sitting at the edge of the pier, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. She held her grandmother's words close, her heart swelling with both exhaustion and hope. She had come to Seattle to present Bridges of Steel. She was leaving with the beginnings of bridges made of something even stronger: dignity, courage, and the fragile but powerful possibility of change. Seattle's night air carried the smell of rain, fresh and electric, as if the city itself had been washed clean. Maya Henderson stood on the balcony of her hotel, overlooking the twinkling lights that stretched across the waterfront. The day had been long, exhausting, but transformative. She had presented her bridge design with confidence, and the committee had embraced it. Tomorrow, official papers would be signed. The first pilot project would begin in Seattle, with more to follow along the Pacific coast. But as Maya gazed at the skyline, she knew that the story was bigger than blueprints and contracts. Her confrontation on Flight 729 had spilled into the world beyond the cabin. It was now part of a national conversation, carried across screens and headlines, stirring debates at dinner tables and classrooms. Clips of Captain Daniel Brooks confronting prejudice had been shared millions of times. And with each share came the reminder that dignity and justice could prevail when someone chose to stand up. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. A flood of messages, congratulations, interview requests, strangers reaching out to thank her. It was overwhelming. But Maya read one message twice. It was from Emily Chen. People are calling you a symbol, but remember, symbols are strongest when they stand for something bigger than themselves. Your bridges aren't just steel, they're hope. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Maya placed the phone down and whispered softly, "Hope is the strongest foundation of all." Meanwhile, across the city in a modest hotel suite, Victoria Langford sat at the edge of her bed. The television was muted, but her face glowed with the light of the news coverage replaying the incident. She saw herself in the videos, red-faced, entitled, every ounce of her arrogance laid bare for the world to see. Shame gnawed at her insides. She had been raised in privilege, shielded from consequences. Yet here, on a plane, at 30,000 feet, she had finally collided with accountability. Her daughter, Chloe, sat cross-legged on the carpet, sketching again. Another bridge stretched across her paper, stick figures smiling under a bright sun. She looked up at her mother with a question in her eyes. "Mommy, do you think Maya will build bridges everywhere? Even for people like us?" Victoria's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, but the question struck her deeper. It wasn't just about bridges of steel. It was about whether Maya or anyone could build bridges strong enough to span the divides in people's hearts. She didn't have the answer yet, but she knew she wanted Chloe to live in a world where the answer was yes. The next morning, Maya woke to a city buzzing with energy. The Seattle Chronicle ran a front-page story, "Engineer Confronts Prejudice, Presents Bridges to the Future." Social media overflowed with hashtags, "Wichor, stand taller," "Whoa, build bridges," "Whoa, Flight 729. Messages poured in from parents, teachers, young girls who said they wanted to be engineers after hearing her story. Maya realized that something had shifted. She wasn't just speaking to officials anymore. She was speaking to a generation. Later that week, Maya stood at the construction site where surveyors marked the future location of her pilot project. Hard hats glinted in the morning sun. Richard Coleman shook her hand firmly. "This is where it begins," he said. "And one day, we'll look back and say this was the turning point." Maya smiled, though her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She wondered about Chloe. Had the little girl kept the napkin sketch? Had she continued to draw bridges? Maya hoped so, because sometimes the smallest hands carried the greatest potential to shape the future. Back in New York, months later, a small package arrived at Maya's office. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a drawing of a bridge spanning over rushing water. "Family safe on top." At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, it read, "Thank you for keeping people safe. I want to build bridges too. Love, Chloe." Maya held the drawing for a long time, tears filling her eyes. She framed it and placed it on her desk beside her blueprints. To her, it was more valuable than any award, because it represented not just her work, but the seeds of change planted in a child's heart. As the months turned into a year, Flight 729 became a reference point in training programs for airlines across the country. Captain Daniel Brooks was promoted to a leadership role, mentoring younger pilots on both technical skill and moral courage. He often spoke about that day, reminding crews that authority wasn't just about flying planes, it was about protecting dignity. Elna Ruiz, the flight attendant who had first tried to mediate, became an advocate for equity training in her airline. She often told new recruits, "You never know when you'll face a test like that. But remember, silence is a choice too. Choose better." And Victoria Langford, once the picture of privilege unchecked, began a quiet transformation. She attended workshops on equity and volunteered with organizations fighting prejudice. It wasn't easy, and some people doubted her sincerity, but she kept going, not for her own redemption, but for her daughters. She wanted Chloe to grow up free of the poison she had once passed down. Chloe herself grew into a young woman shaped by that flight. She studied hard, her notebooks filled not only with math and science, but with sketches of bridges, towers, and cities resilient against storms. She told classmates about the woman she once insulted but later called her hero. And every time she traced a line across paper, she whispered a promise to build bridges stronger than hate. For Maya, success followed. Her design spread across states vulnerable to floods and hurricanes. Cities once paralyzed by storms now had lifelines because of her bridges. But even as her career soared, she never forgot the day she sat in seat 4A, her dignity tested and her strength revealed. She carried that memory like the steel in her bridges, strong, unyielding, essential. On the anniversary of Flight 729, Maya visited Seattle's first completed bridge, the project that had begun it all. She stood at the center of the span, water rushing below, children playing in a nearby park. In her hand she carried Chloe's drawing, now faded at the edges from being handled so often. A journalist asked her quietly, "What does this bridge mean to you?" Maya smiled, her eyes glistening as she looked at the structure rising against the skyline. "It means we can withstand storms, both the ones outside and the ones inside us. It means prejudice doesn't get the last word. And it means that sometimes the most important bridges we build aren't made of steel, but of compassion." The camera clicked, capturing her silhouette against the arching structure. And somewhere in that moment, Maya knew that Evelyn's words had come true. She was building bridges, not walls, and they would stand for generations. For those who had been on Flight 729, the memory never faded. Passengers told the story to friends and family, not as gossip, but as a reminder of what justice looked like when one man chose to speak truth and one woman chose to stand taller. And for the world beyond that cabin, the story lived on as a symbol that dignity can survive humiliation, that compassion can outlast prejudice, and that even a child taught hate can learn to choose love. Flight 729 had carried them from Atlanta to Seattle, but in truth, it had carried them much farther across divides of race, privilege, and fear, into a future where bridges, both steel and human, could hold strong against the storms. Maya Henderson never forgot that. And every time she stood on a new bridge, watching families cross safely, she carried Chloe's drawing in her briefcase. A reminder that the legacy of that flight was not just in the steel that rose from her blueprints, but in the hearts that chose to change. Because in the end, that was the greatest truth of all: excellence builds bridges, prejudice builds walls, and heroes are the ones who make sure the bridges stand. And so, what began as humiliation at 30,000 feet became something far greater. A moment of truth that revealed the power of dignity over prejudice and compassion over hate. Maya Henderson stood tall when it mattered most. Captain Daniel Brooks showed that real authority is measured by justice, not by status. And even young Chloe, once echoing her mother's words, left that plane holding a bridge sketch that carried her toward a better future. This story is not just about a confrontation on a flight. It's about the bridges we choose to build every day between strangers, between generations, between hearts divided by fear. It reminds us that silence in the face of injustice is also a choice, and that even the smallest voices can be reshaped by courage and truth. So as you leave this story, carry its lesson with you. Excellence builds bridges, but prejudice builds walls, and the world will always need more bridge builders. If this touched your heart, let it touch someone else's too. Like, share, and subscribe to join our community of stories that speak for justice and humanity. Because together, we can make sure dignity always finds its voice